What's up everybody and welcome to Camera Intermediate. My name is Saxon and we'll be starting the class in just a little bit today. But welcome to Intermediate Camera Knowledge. Let me close the door and then let me angle this guy because I'm going to stand while I give the presentation. Perfect, that'll be enough where you guys can see me. 2 seconds, I'm going to close the door and then we'll give it a few minutes for people to join and we'll get started. Pretty quiet class, nobody to visit in person today, but we'll go through everything. As always, if you guys have any questions while I'm teaching the class, please comment, ask questions. You have the comment area, and if not, at the very end of my presentation, my email address and phone number for work will be there. So by all means, you guys can reach out and let me know questions, maybe outside of class too. But let's get into intermediate camera knowledge, everybody. My name is Saxon. And we're going to be graduating from your point and shoot camera, but more importantly, what we're doing is we're getting away from the automatic controls of our camera. We're getting to a point now where we're becoming more comfortable with our camera. We know where things are located on the camera and we feel good about it, but now we just need to know what to be looking for when we want to now switch things up or play with those dials that our camera has. So, okay, perfect. So, why go advanced point and shoot, DSLR, or mirrorless? So now this is more of a question on why are we moving past our cell phone? And the idea behind that is that we want to be getting a better photo. There's something about the phone pictures and the quality that we're getting that just isn't enough for us, whatever the photographer or the person that's taking the photos. We don't feel right about it, and we want something that has better accuracy, better color. My grandmother the other day put it pretty simply. My family was visiting, and one of my aunts, she was using her iPhone to take a bunch of photos. At the very end, my grandmother commented everybody looks like a bobblehead, and she felt like the heads weren't correctly sized to the bodies, and people didn't look proportionally correct, and a lot of that is true. That is something that you can get from using a phone camera, is distortion. So really what we're looking for when we look at an advanced point and shoot, a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, we're looking for a better camera. We're looking for better quality images, and we're looking for sharpness. We're looking for clarity. We're looking for background blur. We're looking for better lighting, better coloration. There's something that we're trying to achieve within our photos that makes us want to move from our phone or our tablet to something more professional like a camera. So the very first thing I'm going to talk about is a snapshot versus a photograph. And I categorize these in two different ways, and I like to talk about them in two different ways. So a snapshot is what you'd see here. And a snapshot is a quick image. It's a quick snap. It's a way for us to document something without necessarily taking a lot of time to really set things up and familiarize ourselves with the lighting and with the scenario that we're being presented with. This is something you might do with your phone. My generation, the younger generation, I would even say older generation too. Some people are familiar with an app on your phone called Snapchat. Snapchat gives the ability where you just take a picture of something and you can send it to your friend immediately, and it becomes a text message but with pictures. And you can add stuff onto it, but regardless, this photo to me reminds me of a Snapchat. It's a quick picture you might send your friend if they're like, hey, where you at? Boom, this is where I'm at. Oh, okay, I know where that is. A photograph, though, becomes something a little bit more. And this would be my example of a photograph. It's the same place, same scenario. The only difference is now we've taken the time to maybe analyze the lighting and the color of the area. We've taken our camera and we've actually set it up manually. We've changed the settings on the camera to maybe be darker in certain areas, to vignette in others. We're focusing in on a certain area to give clarity. We've looked at our lines and how they're all moving into the area, moving lines and line movement in an image. That's all things that we're being more cautious of when we're taking a photograph. We're actually taking the time to analyze the area that we're in so we can frame it better and take a better picture. So more thought goes into a photograph and less thought goes into a snapshot. So again, this is an example of a snapshot. This is the escalator leading up to our mattress section here at Apt. And in the next picture, it's the same area, just with more color. So it really goes to show that if you take the time and set your camera up and you play with the dials and you're more in tune with your environment, you can make a very dull or mundane area look very bright, colorful, and very satisfying or exciting to look at. The first step, and I preface this in the first class and in my intro, is learn your camera. I can't stress this enough to everybody. It's one thing to sit there and use your camera on automatic all the time and to play with it, but it's another thing to know the dials, the knobs, and terminology and verbiage that goes into being a camera user. You know, when we talk about light and we talk about letting light into the camera, when we talk about shutter speed, when we talk about f-stops, when we talk about the ISO, we're talking about all things that are very native to cameras, and you won't see these types of terminologies in other devices. So it's important that we not only understand the camera on the level of what we're using it at, but we want to also understand at least the terminology of everything else on the camera. It furthers our understanding, and it's similar to when you go to a mechanic's for your car. When you go to a car mechanic and you're saying, you know, hey, I've got a problem with my carburetor or something in my transmission blew. That's a lot different than telling them, you know, hey, I see smoke coming out of my car over here. It's coming from this big engine block thing. It's a lot different when you don't understand where you're trying to send people to when you do. So it's important to know that. Hey, welcome in. I'm good, how are you?
I'm sorry.
Oh, you are totally fine. Have a seat. We literally got 2 slides in. Good to see you. Good to see you. Have a seat. So that's the first step, as always. Learn your camera. It's important to make sure that you understand what you have. Let's see where slides changing. There we go. So the next thing we'll talk about is the difference between a JPEG or a RAW. Now, we've learned our camera, we're moving on from that. We have a better understanding of where buttons are and where things are located. But now we want to talk about the physical image that we're getting from the camera. Last class we talked a good depth about SD cards. We talked about what an SD card is, how it stores the photo. But now your camera can do a couple different things as far as the photo quality goes. It can do a JPEG or a RAW, and those are going to be the 2 things that you see the most of. Now a JPEG is going to be a compressed image file. That's going to be your standard image. Most of the times when you're taking a picture as a JPEG. And usually, most people have no issues with a JPEG. That's exactly enough for them. You can use that for social media. You can print a JPEG. You can upload a JPEG to a computer. You can send it in an email. You can use it on your phone, on a tablet. There's almost unlimited things you can do with a JPEG. A RAW file, on the other hand, is a much larger file. So if a JPEG, let's say, is 12 megapixels on your camera, a RAW file might be 48 megapixels. The thing with a RAW is that it's collecting more information for what you're taking a picture of. But by doing that, it's going to not process or not compress the image. So when you look at a RAW photo versus a JPEG photo, the RAW photo will look a little bit more washed out. It'll look a little less bright than the JPEG will. But when we go through the settings of the RAW and we actually edit the photo, we get what we see all the way on the right side, which is a processed RAW photo. Now a processed RAW photo is going to be the image at its best quality that we can get without adding any more Photoshop or editing to it. And what we're doing there is we're really looking at different levels of color, hue, saturation, all these different types of stuff that I don't really go into full detail with this class. It's a new class I'm getting ready to do called Advanced Photography, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the class to mention but we're going to do that in June. I'm going to talk more about editing in the future. But for those who are trying to learn editing, I would definitely recommend watching some videos online on it, familiarizing yourself with it. I'll do my own class on it eventually, but when you're taking a picture, you're either shooting as a JPEG or a RAW. The RAW file will come out a little bit muted, almost sunburnt if you will, and the JPEG will come out more finished, but it'll be compressed. So it'll be a much smaller file size. You're not able to zoom in as far, and there's a few other drawbacks to JPEG, but they're very minor. With a RAW file, once you process that RAW and you go through and you play with all its colorations and everything else, you can really make a beautiful image that shows all the different coloration the way that you want it to be seen. So if we look with the JPEG file, the hair is pretty dark. Where the folds are, we can see them clearly, but there's certain areas that get washed out where we don't see a lot of detail. When we move over to the RAW, everything feels very sandy or sunburnt. It just doesn't feel there. It's kind of missing. But when we look at the processed RAW, we can see the different coloration between his hair where the sunlight's coming through. We can see the shine of the guitar as he's playing, or the bass. We see all the wrinkles on the shirt. The leather strap is a little bit more clear. The image as a whole has a different vibrancy to it than the JPEG. And that's what we're getting when we take the time and we process a RAW image. Now, editing software you can look at. These are something I just updated not long ago. I would say the two on the left, Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom, are my two most popular photo editing softwares that I've seen. Photoshop is great if you're trying to take one image that you've spent a lot of time on and you really want to make some big changes to it. Lightroom, though, is what I see a lot of people using more and more nowadays, and Lightroom is a very quick and easy way to change coloration on your photo and really bring in the appropriate amount of light on the photo post after you're done taking photos. So definitely would recommend them, and there's so many different videos and walkthroughs on how to use both of them. When we do get into advanced photography one day, my goal is to show the different things that you'll be asked about and looking at when you're editing a photo to help. Other softwares that aren't necessarily a monthly fee, ones that you pay one time and then you have access to almost ever, would be Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro. Both are wonderful photo editing apps. They are a little bit differently laid out than Photoshop and Lightroom, but depending on what you like as a user, you might be interested in either of those two brands as well too. Now the mode dial, we talked a little bit about this the last class, and the thing that we stood on or got stuck on was the automatic. And I wanted to make sure we stayed at auto because auto is going to do all the work for you. You're just pointing the camera and taking the picture. Now we're going to talk about more of the manual controls. How do you do all the work now so you can get a more precise image based on what your preferences are? And that's where we get in today. So before we do that, these are your next steps as far as the dial is concerned. So the main 5 that you're going to see is automatic, which that's where your camera is taken control over by the camera itself. The camera's brains do all the work for you. You point and shoot and take the picture. Program Auto gives you the ability to program certain parts of your camera to be automatic, but then you do the rest of the work. So this is just a recap from last week when we talked about this. Aperture priority is where the camera, you're controlling the aperture of the camera, but then everything else is controlled by the camera itself. Shutter priority controls the shutter speed of the camera and the speed at which the shutters are closing, but then the camera controls everything else. And full manual, which we'll be getting into at the end of class, is going to be what you're looking at when you control every setting on the camera and you're doing all of the work manually. So the big thing we're looking at today is what we call the exposure triangle. And what we'll do is we'll break down each section by itself, and I'll relate into there how then they are important with the other two. But the idea is that if we're taking a photo, there are basically going to be 3 different sides to the triangle. One side will be the speed at which the shutter closes. That's our shutter speed. One side of the triangle is going to be our aperture. That is the openness of our iris on the camera. And then the other one on the triangle, the bottom section, is going to be the ISO. And the ISO is the amount of sensitivity that the megapixel sensor has towards light. And again, we're going to break all three of these down individually to understand them, but that's the main gist of the three. Together, they form the exposure triangle. Once you get to a point where you can use it, it's exciting because this means you have full control, manual control over the camera once you understand these three. So, first one up, we have aperture. Aperture priority controls the iris of the camera. The best way to think about that is like your eyeball. If you look at your eye, you have a little black dot on your eye. Depending on your exposure to the sunlight, your iris on your eye will get really small or really big depending on the amount of light that it sees. The smaller it gets, the less light it's letting in. By doing that, it's giving you the chance to perceive things a little bit darker, so that way the bright sun doesn't damage your eyes or hurt your eyes. That's your eye's natural response to protect themselves and to allow us to see the appropriate amount of light. The more wide they are, the more light that we see. That's why at night, let's say you wake up in the middle of the night and you go to the bathroom and you turn the lights on in the middle of the night, usually it hurts. It's like, ooh, it's too much. The reason is because your eyes are wide open. So they're trying to get as much light as possible because you're waking up from sleeping where you were completely had your eyes closed, they were dark. So with aperture on a camera, it does a similar effect, but the main thing we're trying to get with aperture is background to foreground separation. So if I'm the foreground here, I'm the main subject that you're trying to take a picture of, this would be my background. For some people, the background's not as exciting, so we want to blur the background out. For others, we want to see the person and the background. That's where aperture comes into play. So the lower the number is on the aperture, the more of the subject we'll see, but the less of the background that we'll see. The higher our number, our ability then increases to see both our subject and our background. So if, let's say, you and the family go to the pyramids in Egypt and you want to take a picture of your family standing in front of the pyramids, you wouldn't want to use something like an f1 or an f2 because it would blur the background out and you wouldn't be able to see it. You'd want to use something closer to f22 or f16 where you're able to capture the background and the foreground at the same time. Now, let's say that you're trying to take a portrait photo for a client and you're trying to get a really nice clean photo, they want to put it on their resume. That's where you want to use a lower number like f2.82 or 1.4 because then you're going to be able to blur the background out and focus only on the person that you're trying to focus on. And then the numbers in between, because there's a lot of different times where maybe we don't want to blur the background out completely. We want to leave something available to the viewer to see. You can choose that by setting your aperture at the priority that you want it to be. The thing to keep in mind while you're setting it, though, is that the lower your f-stop goes, the less light that comes into your camera. So to keep that in mind when you're using manual, you'll have to then readjust your shutter speed and your ISO to make sure that you're at an appropriate level to get the best image possible. That's where full manual takes a little bit of thought. You can use the aperture priority setting by itself, and that would give you control over the background and foreground separation. And I should have some examples to break that down a little further. So for example, I have my squirrel and I have my dogs. With our dogs, we can clearly see the main dog's nose in focus. That's the main focus point. And when we look to the background, we can see that our background is blurred out. But we can still make out the background. We can still tell that this is another dog. So for this, I would recommend if we look back... Yes, possibly. That's what I would say too. I would say between an f8 and an f5.6 because we can still make out the background slightly, but we can't see it completely. So we can tell that's another dog, but we can't really see much else. Now looking at our squirrel on the other hand, we see our squirrels in perfect focus, but if we didn't have this little greenery and this little greenery, we probably wouldn't be able to tell that it's in a tree. Maybe because we've got a little piece of wood right here. but I would imagine that this is in a branch, and we're probably using something closer to an f1.4 or an f2. So we're really blurring out that background, focusing in on our main subject to get our image. Now another thing that people are looking for when they're using aperture priority or when they're looking at aperture on their manual camera is going to be bokeh. Bokeh, it's B-O-C-E-H. Bokeh is an effect where when you blur the background out and you have lights in the background, they're going to turn circular or almost in this kind of pixelated pattern. They call those bokeh dots. Some people like this look because basically it kind of insinuates that your primary focus is on the subject and that everything in the background doesn't matter. Other things that it can show too is it can bring in a certain level of creativity or anonymity to the subject because the background really shows no resemblance to anything. So in this case, I can tell you that these are all Christmas lights. But the way that our photographer focused on our Lego figure, he blurred the background out, or she blurred the background out to a certain degree now where you can't make out the background at all, but you know that the subject matter is there. So it brings more attention to the subject matter, gives you a more creative background. So why would you want to use the aperture priority mode on your camera, so the AV or the A setting? You want to use it because you're someone who is possibly going in between a background and non-background related photo area. Let's say you're on vacation or you are, I had one for, for sports. I had a mom who came in for a senior night that she was getting ready to take photos for. And we had talked about, what she was trying to capture, and I told her that aperture priority would probably be her best thing to use, and she asked me why. And I told her that with the aperture priority, because you don't have anything really moving in a lot of motion, there's not a lot of speed, shutter speed doesn't have to be your main concern. But because you have areas where the background doesn't matter, and then sometimes where the background does matter, where having the foreground so far away from the background, etc., I think that aperture priority would probably suit you better. It gives you more control over your ability to frame the subject matter and capture the background, or to completely get rid of the background and just focus in on your subject matter. So if you're a portrait photographer, if you're doing wedding photography, if you're doing vacation photography where the lighting is pretty good and you don't have to concern yourself with that, or the objects you're taking pictures of aren't speeding past you or moving at a fast rate, aperture priority should get the job done without having to make you fiddle with all the other dials. So to review again, the higher the f-stop is, the greater the aperture is. The more we're going to see both our foreground and our background. The smaller the number gets, the less of the background we're going to see, and the more of the foreground or the main subject matter that we're going to get. So with f32, we can clearly see the water, the grass, the trees, then we can see that blue garbage can sitting on the parking lot. As we continue to blur the background out, we lose the garbage can and we only have our main subject matter. So it's another thing to think about too. If you have a beautiful photo and let's say something in the background is ugly or unappealing and it really isn't helping your photo, maybe blurring the background out completely, it might take away from what you're photographing, but it also could help you get rid of the clutter. Now we'll move into the second leg of the exposure triangle, and that's shutter speed. So aperture controls your relationship to your background and your foreground, also how much light is coming into the camera via the lens barrel. The shutter speed is going to dictate how fast your shutters are closing, giving you the image that you see. So 1 second is going to be our standard unit of measurement. Now, 1 second is going to be a very long time to let your shutter stay open for. We want to be faster. So typically what you'll see is for most people, they like to shoot somewhere around that 1/250th to to 125th of a second. That means 125 of a second that shutter is closing. I'm terrible at math, so saying that out loud always is weird. But it takes 125ths of 1 second for the shutters to close to get your image. Now you can go slower than that. You can go 1/60th, 1/30th, 1/15th, and so on and so forth, half a second. What's going to happen there, though, is the camera's going to take in more information, but whatever we're taking a photo of, if that's at good motion or moving, we're going to get blurriness. So the faster our shutter speed closes with something that's moving fast, the more likely we are to freeze that action and get a good picture. The slower our subject matter is moving, the slower we can let our shutter speed close. So depending on what you're taking a photo of, that's where you want shutter speed to play a factor. Shutter speed should not be the factor that changes how much light is coming into your camera. That's what you have ISO and aperture for. Your shutter speed is really meant for you to make sure that you're capturing a subject at the appropriate speed at which it's moving. Now, to use very slow shutter speeds, and I would say slow would be 1/15th or less, I definitely would recommend a tripod. Because if you're going to go that slow, even if you wiggle your hand slightly, it will show up on the photo. So if you're going to go very slow with the shutter, putting your camera on a smooth surface or putting your camera on a tripod of some sort is definitely recommended. So some examples of some shutter speeds. Freezing action should be at a 1/1000th or faster. If you are taking pictures of the NASCAR event that's coming up in Chicago at the end of July, if you're going to, the races for the Kentucky Derby or the Churchill Downs, if your kids play baseball or football or basketball and they're running constantly, you want to make sure that you're getting a camera or you're using your camera with a shutter speed greater than 1/1000th or faster. And the reason I say that is because the speed at which your subject is moving, it's very easy to get a blurry image from that. So we have to plan. If the camera is moving at a faster rate for the shutter speed, we're more likely to capture a still, maybe slightly blurry, but a lot less blurry than what we would have gotten if we used a slower speed. So for our surfer, an example, our surfer's in pretty much all clarity. We can see him, we can see the surfboard perfectly. I'd say the area where we see some blurriness is some of the water right here. That's probably moving a lot faster than our surfer is, but that's not the main point of the photo. The main point would be our surfer. So we want to make sure we're getting that guy in clarity. Another thing what we use shutter speed for is to give that sense of motion. It's very easy for us to get a still image when we're trained and when we've been practicing, but it's hard sometimes to convey motion without getting a very blurry picture or a unsettling photo. So right now I'd say one of my biggest clients that I have that comes in to buy cameras from me are birders. They're bird photographers. I have more and more people who come in that love watching birds and they love taking pictures of birds. It's their favorite hobby. The summertime, the springtime, we see a lot of big migrations from the south up north. So we have a lot of these birds that are even going further past Illinois, make their way through, and I get a lot of people who come in and buy these long lenses and these very fast cameras just to get pictures like this. So in this case we have a woodpecker, and we can see the coloration on the woodpecker, the beautiful yellow, some of the blue and green on its feathering, the brown colors too, as well as that red on the beak or that orange on the beak. But then when we look at the wings, we're seeing a little bit of motion, we're seeing a little blurriness. Now that photo is probably being taken at least about 1/1000th and faster. I probably would say this is 1/15,000ths, 1500ths. Just it's a very fast shutter that we're able to get this image. But we still have a little bit of movement on the wings, and that gives us a sense of motion that makes it feel like this bird is alive, that it's moving. So it's a cool picture. We also create mood with long exposures. So One of the things with shutter is not only can it move faster, but it can move slow. So in this case, if we look at this image, we see a lot of detail in the greenery. We see a lot of detail in the rock. The water looks layered. It doesn't look like it's been on there for a short period of time. What we're seeing here is a long exposure with the B setting on the camera. On the camera itself, you'll see a section called B. That stands for bulb. And what bulb does is it allows you to keep your shutter open for as long as you want. So from there, what I would say is, for this one, you have a waterfall that's happening right in front of you. You may set your tripod up with your camera right in front of it, and your camera's pointed towards your waterfall. You're able to press the trigger of the camera and then let the camera sit. The camera is going to get as much information as it can for what it's taking a photo, and the things that aren't moving, it's able to get it in much more detail. So like the moss and the rocks over here, it can get that coloration, it can get that detail because the image isn't moving. Same thing over here. There's a light blurriness, but not much. Maybe not a very breezy day. But the area where you have some blur, the most movement, is the water. And even the water shows pretty consistent streams in certain areas. So we know the water is falling in the same pattern, but there's areas where the water looks a little bit blurry, and that's probably because the water is moving into other directions. So with long exposures, as opposed to the quick moving shutter, you can get more detail. You can get more movement out of them. The only thing you have to be careful of when doing long exposure is if you're moving your camera. So if you want to do long exposure, tripod or setting your camera on a smooth surface, those would really help. So this is another example of long exposure. So this would have been someone who set their camera up on like a bench. They had it pointed towards the train. The train is whizzing past the person. We've got the bike, which is in perfect focus. That bike's not moving. We have the roof and the floor of this place. Neither are moving, so it's also in perfect clarity. And our gentleman who's standing right there, that's not moving, so that's also in perfect clarity. But we see the lights of the train as they're passing by. We can even see through the compartments of the train, and we can read the signs on the wall on the other side. So what we're seeing here is that even with a still photo, we can capture movement, and the movement being the train, while still keeping things in perfect clarity because we're using the longer exposure, the B setting on the camera, with a tripod or a bench or a smooth surface. So you can get very creative with this and take some fun photos. So why use shutter priority? This would be the photo to explain why to use it. If you getting a picture that looks like this, you're probably somebody who wants to use the shutter priority on your camera. This allows you to make sure that things that are moving, you can capture them in a stillness that then allows you to get a clear shot of what you're trying to get. So these guys are playing soccer or they're playing ultimate frisbee. He's trying to throw the ball in or throw the frisbee, but from here, you can't really make that out. You can tell he's running, you can tell he's chasing, and he's got something in his hand, but you don't know what it is. If the camera was a little bit more still and you got a faster photo off, you probably would have been able to get that image in perfect clarity. So why use shutter priority? The main reason you'd want to use it is because you have objects in motion. They're moving fast enough that you're trying to capture them and slow them down to get them in the perfect frame. Another example that I have, this was definitely shot with at least a 1 in 1,000th or 1 in 1,500ths of a second. Here you have a dirt bike guy driving on the dirt bike, does a trick in midair. They look very clear, the image itself looks very clear, the lights are a little bit blurred out, we're getting kind of a bokeh effect, but it's not that much. So the f-stop probably didn't matter in this case for the person shooting, they were probably focused on the shutter speed. Now the next thing we'll talk about is ISO. And ISO is the last part of our exposure triangle before we talk about lenses at the end of the class today. Shutter speed ISO is your camera's ability to be sensitive towards light. Back in the day, ISO was used, or ISO was written on the film. You would buy a pack of film at the store and it would say Kodak 100 or Kodak 200. And that's what ISO is basically referring to. That number that was written on there was the film's sensitivity towards light. The digital camera, because we don't use film, we can change our ISO at any time. So you could take a photo at ISO 100, and then you could say, no, I don't like that, and you could switch to 800. You could switch to 400, 200, and you can take a picture, a different picture, or the same picture with multiple different ISOs without having to change too much in the camera. ISO is going to be your camera's ability to accept more light into it and become more sensitized to it. When we look at this picture, it's the same shutter speed and aperture for every picture. The ISO changes per picture. So when we look at the first one, it feels very dark. The sunset is muted. It doesn't feel like it's doing a lot of work for us. And we really can't make out the beach and the water that we're seeing here. When we move to 200, the sky gets a little bit lighter, and we can start to break and see all that stuff on the beach there. But once we get to 400 and 800, now we have a beautiful amount of light coming underneath both of our piers there. We have enough light on the opposite side of the bridge so we see all of that in clarity. And then on top of that too, our beach is in full clarity too. It's got a lot of light. So if I were taking the photo, I probably would want to do a 400 or an 800 on there to bring out the sunset a lot more, and then to show the shine of the water and the beach and how all those colors are playing together. ISO though can also equate to noise. So when we think about ISO and the ability for our camera to become more sensitive towards that light, we also have to think about the noise that it creates. So because it's becoming so sensitive to light, you can almost get this crackle or this static look to your photos. They just won't look right. They'll look pixelated. We call that noise. And noise comes because your sensor is now too sensitive to the light. It won't damage your camera or do anything. It'll just produce a bad photo. So it's important that when we're looking at the camera and we're looking at our photo, we can go very high with our ISO. But if we have light coming in from other sources, or we have something coming through that is going to provide light to us, that could create noise on our photo. In worst case scenarios, it's almost better to use less ISO than more ISO and just keep changing that number if you're manually controlling it. You can also set your ISO to be auto ISO, and I believe in the next slide I answer that question. Auto ISO and when to use it. I had a person who came in and their kids were about to go to prom, and they were about to take photos for prom. They were going to take photos indoors, outdoors, and then at this golf country club. When I talked to her about it, she was like, what do I set my camera to take those photos? I told her to use the automatic ISO for that. And the reason I told her to do that is because you're going to be going indoors, outdoors, then back indoors, then back outdoors. Let your camera dictate what light needs to come into it. You focus on the aperture or the shutter. You don't need to worry about the ISO itself. So auto ISO, I would recommend using it when you're going from area to area and it's going to continuously change the lighting. If you're in a zone where the lighting stays the same or might just fluctuate based on the clouds, or maybe a couple bulbs here or there, keep it on, whatever number you have your ISO set to. But if you're going to be going in and out of different areas where light is existent, then non-existent, then big, then small, auto ISO is great for that. Now to review again, all three of these can work together, and we call this the exposure triangle. That is our shutter speed, our f-stop, and our ISO. We can control all three under the manual setting, and we can then dictate whatever those numbers we want to be based on our past experiences with whatever photos we're taking. However, we can also on the mode dial control each one of these settings individually. The only one that you really can't is ISO. ISO you can set to be auto, or you can change the numbers on almost all of them, but there's no one dial to go to just play with ISO. So with your f-stop, you're controlling your foreground to background separation from your subject to wherever it is. So in this case, we have our piggy sitting on the couch. We can see the pillows and where the wall meets in the background. And as we slowly start to go down to that lower f-stop, we start to lose the background, and we mainly get a picture of our piggies. So again, depending on our relationship with our foreground to our background, reasons why we're playing with the f-stop are to either blur out or emphasize the background and create a separation or a connection between our foreground. On the bottom, we then have shutter speed. With shutter speed, this is the way that our camera is closing its shutters to capture things that are moving fast or slow. The faster the object is moving, the faster we want our shutter speed. So in this case, we have a hammer that's swinging and it's hitting a piece of wood. At the 1 in 1,000, we can see the fist and the hammer at a perfect range. We see them all in clarity. 1 in 250th, we see the hand, but now our hammer is blurred. 1/60th, we see the fingers, but now we're losing the hand and the hammer. And then once we get lower, we barely can make any of that stuff out. So again, it's appropriate to make sure that we're setting our shutter speed to the appropriate number based on what our object is doing and how fast it's moving. We can also on there keep in mind that the faster our shutter speed goes, it continuously makes the photo darker and darker and darker. So the shutter speed and the f-stop will control how much light you're getting on a photo. So it's important that if you're controlling all three of these things together, you keep in mind that while these two are separate and they do two different things, they work together. The last thing we have is ISO. ISO is then the ability for our camera to intake light and for the sensitivity of that. When we start at the ISO 100, we can clearly make out that this is a penny, and we can see the wood grain for the table that it's sitting on. The lighter, or the higher our ISO goes, the lighter our image gets. The more noise that we get per image, the less dark shadows that we get per image, and the more we start to lose clarity on the image based on it taking in too much light to produce our image. So it's important to remember all three of these things, but then to remember that they are all together, but they all function separately of each other if you choose to do so. So it's your call as a photographer if you want to have control over one of these things, all of these things, or if you choose to just use automatic still. You can always do that. Some people will complain when they're using automatic that an image doesn't look quite right, and that's where I tell people the camera is only so smart. And this is where then we come into play, and then we do all the rest of the work. And the better that you become, or the more familiar that you become with this, the easier it is when you're playing with your camera to then set and readjust based on your environment. Another thing that comes up on the camera, and it's very popular for digital cameras, is the exposure meter. The exposure meter is a meter on the bottom of either your LCD screen or your viewfinder, depending on what you're looking through. And typically for different brands, it'll look a little bit different. For Canon and for some brands, they like to do a little home plate or a upside down house, being the 0 marker. And then they'll go +1, +2, or -1, -2. And we call the ones a stop. So the exposure meter will move one stop over to the left or to the right, giving you either more light or less light. It's not necessarily the ISO, and people get these two mixed up. ISO is going to change your camera's sensitivity towards light. Exposure is going to change your camera's exposure to that light. So it's either going to make it more exposed or less exposed. This is something that the sensor is doing by itself. So when you play with the dial, you can either make it darker by moving it towards the negatives, or you can make an image lighter by going towards the higher numbers. While you're looking at it through the screen or through the viewfinder, you can play with that dial and you can actually visibly see your image get lighter or darker. So it's a really nice way of, let's say you've played with your f-stop already, you've played with your ISO already, and you've got your shutter speed dialed in, but the image just still is too dark. Well, then maybe you take your exposure meter and you make it a little lighter. Or maybe it's too bright, too much sun, but you're at where you need to be. Maybe you make it a little darker. You can do both. So it's a nice way of also playing with your camera's sensitivity towards the light or exposure towards the light, without having to readjust your ISO, your f-stop, or your aperture. Or shutter speed, I should say. Now again, what we're really working on here is we want to get people to feel comfortable, not necessarily saying you have to use it all the time, but we want people to get comfortable with the idea of full manual control over the camera. The real, truest way to have the perfect photos is to fully learn what full manual means and to execute it as best as possible. Your camera's great, and I tell people who are just starting that automatic is going to be able to take your photos better than you would when you first start. But as you become better at taking photos, you're going to notice that the color might look off on an image, or the speed at which you shot that picture, there's a little bit of blurriness. Or maybe, you know, the mom I was helping the one day, she was at her son's lacrosse game, and the one thing she couldn't get was the shutter speed. It was just too dark no matter how fast and what ISO she turned it to. So I told her this might be a time where now you have to look at full automatic. You have your lens open to your f2.8, so the widest it could go, and now you're allowing for your shutter speed to have the fastest shutter it can at the most wide open aperture. That should allow as much light in as possible. She tried that out and it worked for her. It actually did. So sometimes, even though you have control over your aperture through your A setting on your camera or through your TV setting if it's the shutter speed, sometimes you still need to go full manual to get the best image possible. So these next images, what I like to do is I like to go through and break down what I see for f-stop, what I see for ISO, and what I see for shutter speed to help give you kind of more of an education on what you should be looking at when you look at stuff. So in this case, we have a landscape photography. This is most likely somewhere in Germany or in the Swedish area. I can tell by it saying Hassan and Yo on the one side there. I forgot. I think I looked it up. It's like a paper factory. I could be wrong. Regardless, though, you've got this bridge going over. It's a pretty dark image. So as far as light coming in, there's not a lot of light. So we would probably want to turn our ISO up a little bit higher to equate for not having a lot of light. The reason I think the ISO is turned up on this case is because I see a little bit of noise underneath the poles there where it's the darkest on the image. I could see a little bit of graininess. So the ISO is probably up a little bit higher, maybe a 3200, maybe 800. ISO, it's always a little bit difficult to tell the number, but I can tell it's a little bit higher because of what I'm seeing in the corners. Now, as far as an f-stop, I'm seeing both my background pretty well, and I'm seeing my foreground pretty well. If I had to take a guess though, I do see the grain on the wood, and the background does look a little off. So I imagine that the f-stop is probably something closer to like a 16, or maybe a 22, but it also could be a little lower than that, maybe like 12. As far as shutter speed goes, I don't think this really had to be done at a fast pace. The only reason that I think it could have been done at a little bit of a faster speed was because these lights are very bright, and then the way that they're being so bright, I could see it being done with a faster shutter speed, but at the same time, I think maybe 1 1/100th or maybe 1 60th of a second is probably enough for this one. 60th might be a little bit slower, but I definitely think 1 100th of a second is probably what they shot this at, either with a tripod or standing up. With our cherry blossoms here, I can see the front row of cherry blossoms very clearly, and I can see here as well, and a little bit of this guy over here too, as it cuts across this branch. But for the most part, everything else is blurred out. Now, it's not blurred out enough that I can't tell that those are other branches of a cherry blossom tree. So I probably would guess that this one's probably closer to like an f5.6 or f6, something where I can still see the background, but not a lot. There's not a lot of graininess on this, so like even the darkest parts on here look very saturated, they look good. So ISO is probably at a really low number, maybe ISO 100 or ISO 200. Shutter speed wise, unless there was a wind going back and forth preventing these from really getting a clear image, I imagine the shutter speed was pretty slow. Maybe again 1 250th of a second at the fastest, but most likely 1 100ths or 1 60ths. Next, we have our fireman. I've got my fireman in the front who's in perfect clarity, and then we have a fireman behind him who we can't see. However, we can see a face, we can see the helmet, and we can see some of the same shirt and the walkie-talkie there, so we know that's another fireman behind our first fireman. So if I had to guess, it's probably also in the same boat, an f-stop of maybe 4, 5.6, 6.5, something where I can still make out my background, but not clearly. As far as our fireman, there's really no pixelation or noise on him. So I imagine that the ISO on this one probably was also kept at a lower number, maybe 100, at the worst maybe an 800. That's where I keep my ISO personally, and sometimes it usually you don't see any grain with it. Going from that though, shutter speed wise, again, can't imagine this was done with a lot of speed to it. Maybe if they're walking, maybe the person's using 1 250th of a second or 1 100ths, but I imagine this is closer to 1 60th of a second or 1 100th of a second. We have our RAM. The RAM is in pretty good clarity. The background is slightly blurred out, but it's not blurred out enough that I can't tell that this is some sort of snowy area. Maybe that looks like a tree trunk back there. So I probably would say that this is an f-stop of 4, 5.6, possibly 6. From there though, the aperture is very open because I can see a lot of detail on the horns, and I'm getting a lot of clarity on this guy as a whole. So that's where the f-stop kind of confuses me a little bit there. I probably would say it's closer to a 4, just based on how clear this person, the goat is. As far as the color and where all the dark parts are, this looks fully saturated, all the dark parts on the chest, so I don't think ISO is very high. I would also say a 100 to 200, and depending on the speed at which this goat is moving, as it's walking around, as the ram is moving, I probably also wouldn't put it at a high f-stop unless this thing was running around and it just stopped. Or a shutter speed, I should say. 1 100ths or 1 60ths, I think also would be the same. Now this is where we get a little bit faster. So now we've got some movement in both of these photos. I would put this anywhere between 1 1,000ths or 1 1,500ths of a second, because we have 2 dogs that are getting airborne to catch the frisbees, so they're moving at great speed. The photographer did a really good job of making sure that the dogs were caught in stillness, so definitely 1 1,000th or 1 1,500ths of a second. As far as ISO goes, there's not a lot of dark parts of this photo, even where the dark parts are on the fur and some of the background. None of it looks pixelated. So ISO again, probably a very low number, 100 to 800 I would say for that. As far as background blur goes, we definitely have more blur here and less blur over here. Now, being that I've taken photos for so many years, I can kind of tell by the shine coming off of these items and the red where it's at, that that's most likely cars in the background. So it's still a very low aperture. It's probably going to be maybe a 2.8, or I wouldn't say 2 because I could still make the background out. I would say 2.8 to 4. It's probably what we're looking at for the background there. For this guy, very similar. I would also say 2.8 to 4 because you can tell that that's a group of trees in the background or some shrubs or a forest preserve, but obviously you can't make out exactly what they are. Next, we have our football player jumping into the end zone for a touchdown. When we look at the football player, they're in perfect clarity. And not only are they in clarity, but you can actually see where the turf pellets are starting to fly into the air because he's running his hand on the turf as he slides in for the touchdown. So right off the bat there, we get that pixel. We get the pixels from the physical turf. We get the person in movement, so we can tell this was also shot with a shutter speed of 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 1,500. The background is slightly blurred out. We can tell that those are two football players. One missed the tackle, and one was probably running after him as well. But judging on how we can make out and almost clearly tell that that player is number 6, I imagine that this is probably an f-stop of 8, maybe 6. We can still make out the background. There's a slight blur. And as far as ISO is concerned, I wouldn't really think too much about the ISO because the sun is out on this football stadium. You can clearly make everything out. So I probably would put that at about 100 ISO, maybe 200 ISO at the worst. Now we've got this photo of a bike. And from doing this is a long exposure photo. And we found that out because if you look through, you can see these red streaks that cut behind the bike and go across. We can tell that a train of some sort definitely cut through. Now, the ISO on this photo is turned up high. And the reason I can tell that is because I can actually see some of the pixels in this, and as you look at the building, you can kind of tell it's just a little washed out as far as the color, so it's a little overexposed. Now, the shutter is going to be a continuous shutter. The ISO is a little overexposed. As far as f-stop is concerned, this feels pretty open to me, but it also feels like this could be an f4 and f4.5 because you do have some blur on the buildings and some blur on here as well too. But I wonder if that's just because of the intense light and the oversensitivity on that. So this one's a little bit trickier, but again, those couple different settings and changes can make or break how the photo turns out. Now, learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. The big thing is getting out there and taking photos. You take everything I tell you, and it's good to have it and to write it down and to study it. But the best practice you can do is to go out, use your camera, and take as many photos as you can. If you're seeing family on the weekend, bring your camera with, take pictures. If you've got just a day off and you're like, I want to go for a walk, bring your camera around your neighborhood, take pictures of your neighbors' houses, explore. Those are all ways for you to practice, and it's also a way for you to take in your environment. And I think that's something I really love about cameras as a whole, is that if you're using the camera to the best of your ability, what you're really doing is you're becoming a memory keeper. But my best pieces of advice, the best camera accessories that you can get are practice. Going out and taking as many photos as you can, experimenting with new things, trying different techniques, looking different techniques up online. Classes are great. We love classes. My class is great. It's an intro, an intermediate, and soon to be advanced. But what's really cool about classes in general is that you get different people with different opinions. I have an opinion that's different from somebody else who also has a different opinion from somebody else. So you get a lot of different things that help kind of inform your judgment and inform your photo making journey. YouTube channels you love. I have told so many people, I get a lot of parents who want to make videos of their kids playing sports, and they always ask me for tips and tricks, and I tell them the same thing. If there's somebody out there that you see that's doing the videos, taking the photos that you want to take, follow them. Subscribe to their channel. Bookmark their website. Do something where you can keep tabs on this person and you can constantly learn. One of the best pieces of advice I learned when I started playing the banjo was that when you love playing something and you love music or an instrument, play it just like your favorite artist plays it. Because what happens is you learn how they learned it, but then you start to learn it your own way, and you start to make changes and improvements, and before you know it, you might be making your own ketchup, but then all of a sudden you make a special variation of your ketchup that nobody's ever tried before and done. It's a little different. So again, YouTube channels you love, study the people that you love on there, learn what they're doing, copy it, and then improve on it. Become more creative in that way. Workshops are great too. If there's any clubs or workshops, I tell people all the time, I have two groups of people that come in all the time, and they're my three. One of them's a birding club. They love shooting birds, and I mean like taking pictures of birds. They love going out and they'll know when the migration's happening for this owl or when this flock of birds is coming in from the north or the south. And it's really cool, the photos and the images that they get from that. Birds are really fun to take pictures of. I have another group that comes in that shoots pictures at O'Hare Airport. So they actually have permission to go on the runway, and there's like a little loading area where they can sit with their camera and take pictures of the planes as they land and take off. It's really cool. And then I have a group that's out of the Botanical Gardens. Then they're a club that meets every month, I believe, and they have like a photo contest where whoever can take the most pretty picture inside the Botanical Gardens, edit it, and then show it, they'll win, and they'll be put on that month's issue of the Botanical Garden magazine that they send out. So there's a lot of cool clubs and workshops that you can get a part of, and what's cool with that is now maybe you don't have a professor, but maybe you have people that you become friends with in the club that teach you different tips and tricks, and they give you little more pieces of success for you to become a better photographer. And then traveling is still my best thing. If you are even considering going on a vacation this year and you don't bring a camera with you, I think then you're being silly. You need to have a camera with you wherever you go. I like to be known as the friend in the group who always has their camera around their neck, because it's one of those things, if I see something that's cool, I want to be able to take that picture because I might never be able to do it again. So travel, bring your camera with you, and don't be scared to bring your camera. As long as you're being careful with it and you're aware of your surroundings, nobody should take it away from you. But just always be traveling with a camera. It's important. Other recommended accessories, and I know I've mentioned these before, definitely get a bag, definitely get an extra battery and memory card. Lens cleaning kits are great, straps, tripods, an external hard drive to save everything. Get your filters, so polarizing filters, ND filters, and then additional lenses. Now lenses, I would say, is the most important thing next to the camera body. If not, I think a camera lens is the most important thing you should be looking at. When it comes to the camera world, we like to date your body and marry your glass. So it's important to think about it is that your camera body will only last you for so long. A good camera body should last you about 10 to 12 years before you start to notice the camera will slow down. It won't take pictures as fast, it won't load images, maybe it won't be able to focus as properly anymore. When you use your camera, you're going to make it slow down naturally. That's just the reality of it. There's no way of getting around that. So it's important that if you're going to invest your money into photography, put it into your lenses. Your glass, your lenses, those should be the things that you're spending thousands, if not, the majority of your money on when you're buying stuff. These camera brands like Nikon, Sony, Canon, Leica, they're very big on taking their lenses and making them where they'll continue to work with all of their future camera bodies. So when let's say you buy a camera body in 2012, and you get 3 lenses for that camera body, technically you should be able to use those lenses on a new camera body in 2023. There's no reason why you can't. So if you're at a crossroads and you're wondering what to invest more of your money into when it comes to this hobby, I would definitely tell you to put more money into the glass. It pays off in the long run. You get better quality images, and the camera body as a whole will eventually die on you, and it will be time to replace every 10 to 12 years. With lenses, one of the first things we should be thinking about is focal length and zoom. Focal length equates to zoom. And now when it says it's a 70 millimeter lens, it doesn't mean that it's 70 millimeters. It means that its optical distance from your object to you is 70 millimeters. It's a measurement that's created within the camera world that shows you or gives you a number equivalent to what the distance that you're viewing at. So at this viewing distance, we have a flock of birds in the water here. We can see most of the water that's around them, a little bit of this dirt or rough patch of mud that comes out in the water, and then we see this town, greenery, mountains all behind it. Once we move to 105, we start to crop in more. Now we're losing more of the outer surroundings. We move to 200, now we're getting rid of more of that water in front, we're getting closer to that tuff of dirt. But by the time we get to 400, it almost looks like an entirely different photo because we've zoomed in. Or we've used our focal length to go even closer. So again, depending on the camera and the structure that you have, focal length and zoom are basically the same thing. Focal length is the terminology, the millimeter size used to show you a number based on what your viewing distance is. We call it zoom because that's kind of the process of zooming in and zooming out. Telephoto lenses are what these would be called, and we'll talk about that as well in a little bit. Focal length also has something to do with compression. Focal length equates to compression as well too. When we look at focal length, it's important to remember that the human eye itself acts as a 50 millimeter lens. So why they call the nifty 50, why the 50 millimeter is kind of the universal standard. 50 millimeters is what we currently look at when we see through our eyes for a majority of human beings. So when you look, what you're seeing would be the equivalency to 50 millimeters. Anything lesser than 50 or greater than 50 will be a distortion of some sort on the eye. When we look at a higher number like 200 on this little GIF, we can see that the boy's face gets a little fatter. And when we look at a lower number like 35, 20, we can see that the nose comes forward and the face becomes narrow. That's compression. While you're seeing that though, we can also see how the background moves forward and closer. So the boy in the 50 is still standing probably 45 to 100 feet away from this tree. But when we get to the 200 millimeter, the tree almost looks like it's right behind him. But when we get to the 16 millimeter, it feels like the tree is 1.5 miles away from him. So while our subject matter might not be moving, the distance between him and the background is moving, and his face is shrinking forward or out and in. So it's important to remember what type of lens we're using and what the purpose of that lens is going to be, or what the purpose of what we're trying to take a picture is, so we can get the correct lens for that. Common lenses that you're going to see nowadays on the market and what you should be looking for. Right off the bat, if you're buying a camera body, I would always recommend you get something with a kit lens. Kit lens is going to look something similar to this. This is a Nikon variation. It's an 18 to 55. This is a very common kit lens because its f-stop is going to be higher. So for this one, it's going to be a 3.5 to 5.6 for its lowest maximum f-stop. Meaning, at 18 millimeters, it'll start at a 3.5. As you move from 18 to 55, it's going to raise itself to 5.6. That'll be the lowest you can get. So if you're someone looking for background to foreground separation, you're not really going to get it with a kit lens. But what a kit lens will do is it'll give you a chance to try your camera out at a much lower cost with a beginner's lens. Not a bad lens, but it might not give you that fine detail that you're looking for that the more expensive version can. Another common lens that you're going to see is a nifty 50 or a prime lens. Now they call it a nifty 50 because it is a 50 millimeter lens. Now a prime lens can be any single number. So in this case we have a 50 millimeter, but we can also have a 35 millimeter or an 85 or a 105 or a 100. Canon at the current moment makes an 800 millimeter lens that's a prime lens. You can't zoom in or out, it always stays at 800. This will always stay at 50 millimeters. Now, prime lenses typically give us a much lower maximum f-stop. So when we get there, we talk about a telephoto lens. The lowest a telephoto lens can give us is 2.8 if we're getting one of the highest quality telephoto lenses possible. With a prime lens, the lowest you'll see is 1.2, 1.4. So you'll be able to blur the background out to where you don't see anything and you're only focused in on your subject. It's a beautiful, beautiful lens. Very expensive though, but great quality. Zoom lens or telephoto is the exact opposite of a prime. So with our prime, we had a 50 millimeter. It's only 50. Telephoto gives us a number through a number. So in this case, we have a 24 to 70. This is a Canon lens. Over here, we have a Sony G-Master lens. That is going to be a 70 to 200. What we're doing with these lenses is it's something for someone who wants to zoom. They don't have one single number that they're trying to stay on. Their subject might be moving all over the place. Maybe they're filming sports or they're taking a video. So they need something where they can change the distance from their subject matter whenever they want. So a telephoto or a zoom lens would be more appropriate for that. Now again, the lowest number you can get on these is a 2.8 for an f-stop. These can go any way to 4. These can be a variable from 3.5 to 5.6. These can even be a variable from 5 to 6, or 5.6 to 6. The higher quality the lens, the lower that maximum f-stop will be. So in theory, the more money you're putting into your lenses, the better off you'll be to then bring them into other systems, but the better you'll be for clarity and for blur. Prime versus zoom lenses, again, the big thing we're looking at here is that a prime lens is a single number. There is no zooming with this lens. If I am taking a picture with you of a 50, if I want to change this frame, I got to get closer. With a zoom lens, I can stay in the same place, and then the lens will zoom back and forth until I get the angle that I want. So that is the difference between a zoom lens or a telephoto and a prime lens, is the ability to zoom in and out on your subject matter versus having to move your body physically. One will have a lower f-stop than the other if you so choose it, but both have different purposes and needs based on what you're trying to accomplish. The last lens I like to talk about is a travel lens. And the reason I like to talk about a travel lens is because I get a lot of people who come in and they want to buy a brand new camera for vacation. They're like, I love my camera, but I want smaller, or I want something lighter. What we usually try to do, or what I like to try to do, is push somebody to get a travel lens. The lens itself might have not the greatest aperture and f-stop, but what the lens will offer you is a way for you to hit all of the numbers that you might need without needing to change lenses. So in this case, Nikon created an 18 to 135 that'll give you wide angle all the way to zoom. And it'll do it all in one lens, where then you don't have to switch lenses or get a different lens. You can just go on vacation with one set. The only downside to using this is that your f-stop isn't going to be really what you want. So this will be a 3.5 to 5.6, making this a great travel lens, but not a great lens for low light situations. Not a very good lens to back out or to blur out the background and to focus on your subject. But it might be perfect for vacation. Everyday photography, you know, if the kids go to the beach and you want to take this lens with you, this would be awesome for that too. Now, I get asked this a lot of the times, what lenses do you need? The answer to that is not as simple as I wish it could be. Everybody has different purposes and needs and wants, and they have things that they're trying to get, and some lenses might be better off than others. But in the traditional sense of photography, there are 3 lenses, and we call those the Trinity. The Trinity has a 50mm prime, a 24 to 70, and a 70 to 200 or higher than 200. Your 50mm prime is your portrait lens. That is your everyday, your best shooter. Some people will get a 35 prime, some people get an 85 prime. They all relatively do the same thing. Little to no distortion from the 50. You'll get a little distortion from the 85 and a little distortion from the 35, but as a whole, they're going to take a very clean image, and they're what we consider to be either your nifty 50 or your everyday walking around lens. Now, the next one up that I always recommend is your 24 to 70. Your 24 to 70 is your wide angle lens to more of a portrait style lens. And what you're getting with that is the ability to go wide angle for landscape photography, scenery, maybe a wide shot of a family or a group, to 70, which is considered more of your portrait. That's your perfect portrait, no distortion, it's a clean image. Where the 70 to 200 then comes in is that's your zoom lens. That's you're in a nature park and you see the bald eagle fly across the trees. You want to zoom in so you can get as close to that bird as possible. I was in Seattle about 2 years ago. We were hiking through the mountains, and when you looked over the one mountain, you got a whole view of the ocean, and there was this huge freighter that was coming in, and I didn't have a zoom lens with me, so I could only zoom in so close. But the detail that I could see from where I was standing, I'm like, oh, if I could zoom in, I would have gotten such a really pretty photo. That's where something like this would have been great, because I would have had that zoom, I would have had the distance from where I was to get to where I wanted. So again, everybody has different needs and wants for the lenses, but I would say these are the three lenses that if you're not familiar with photography at all and you really just want to get everything up front and be ready to go, these are the three most common lenses that you'll see most people use. Now again, if you're trying to shoot something and these just aren't fitting the bill, that's where looking at different lenses and doing more research to see, this is the type of photography that I'm shooting. What is my best lens for that? Again, Nikon, Sony, Canon, Lumix, Leica, Olympus, Fuji, they all make different lenses with different focal lengths for all sorts of different things. So again, depending on what you're trying to do, it might be appropriate to look at those to see if there's something else that fits the bill. And that's it, everybody. That is my intro to camera, or my intermediate camera class. Next week I'm off. We'll be doing no classes next Thursday. The last Thursday of the month we're doing drones. So I teach the basics of flying drones. I want to let everybody online know that for June the camera class schedule is changing just a little bit because we're going to be adding a new class. The third Thursday of the month we're going to be doing advanced photography now, where I teach people a little bit about photo editing, and we get more into making movies and doing editing with movies and filming and how to understand all of that stuff. Yeah, it'll be a little different. But in the very beginning of that class, we're going to talk kind of where we leave off in this one. So in this case, I teach you about the lenses and I teach you about the controls. I think the last thing that we really need to talk about is then editing the photos, what to look for when you're playing with your editing of your photos, and then what to do with the photo after you're done. After that, we then talk right into videos and film and how to do all that stuff. So that'll be next month in June when we start teaching that. But for everybody else, not this Thursday that's coming up, but the final Thursday of the month, which is May 25th. May 25th, we'll be doing our drones class. And I'll talk about it on that class as well for everybody online, but that class will be changing as well. We're going to be turning the basics on drones. We're going to turn that into alternative cameras. So beyond the traditional camera, we're going to talk about drones, GoPros, camcorders, and action cams. Just anything that is a camera that's not your traditional DSLR or mirrorless camera. What other things are out there that you could be using to make content, videos, photos, all that good stuff. So I'll leave the screen open online. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask. Now is your time. And then I'll answer any questions that my in-class students have. So again, thanks everybody for showing up. I'll leave this open for a little bit longer. If you don't have any questions now, feel free to email or call me anytime. My name is Saxon. I'm here every day except for Tuesdays and Wednesdays of the week. So by all means, reach out anytime. Do you have any questions for me?
Yes, one.
What you got?
Can you see how exposure right here? It goes to glass, that means dark, right?
So when you're using the exposure, if you go to plus, it will make the photo lighter. If you go to the minus side, it'll make it darker.
Oh,
So the exposure,
so
yeah.
that will make
Yeah, so flip that around. So
it
exposure,
darker.
yeah. So when you go towards minus, it'll make it darker. When you go towards plus, it'll make it lighter. So you're adding more light or you're taking light away with the exposure. Your handwriting is beautiful, by the way.
Thank you. Oh, I want to show you
Yeah.
some pictures.
Deal.
See, I love to take pictures of flowers.
Okay.
I love that's
That's your
my
favorite?
favorite. So I love to do that.
And you have the Deluxe 7, right? The Leica?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also I have another one.
Okay.
The one I got that one last year. I got it on Best Buy. There's what is it? The Fuji Film.
Okay, the Fuji.
The Fuji
Yeah.
SD30.
Yeah.
That one.
It's a great camera. I
I
love
like
that
that
one too.
one.
Absolutely.
And I said I only have two. I only did like that and then.
That's the Leica and the Fuji, those are two great cameras to have.
Yeah.
The Leica's great and the Fuji, there's a lot of stuff the Fuji can do, the Leica can't, and there's a lot of stuff the Leica can do, the Fuji can't. So
Yeah,
so
so
two
that's
great
good.
two great cameras to have, absolutely.
And I love how they do the texture and everything is very, very nice. I like it.
Good.
I'm gonna show you. Right. There's one picture.
Yeah, by all means.
It's just it. I'm sorry to put them.
You're fine, you're not. I'm gonna close this video because I don't think anybody has any questions. But guys, thanks again for joining. If anything